Welcome back, everybody. We are in Unit 1, still the Age of Revolution. And in our last two videos, we looked at the Enlightenment, these ideas of rights and privileges and the interaction between the people and their government. And we're going to start taking those ideas and actually putting them into place, actually putting them into action in the real world. And our first example of that is going to be a little bit of American history. So we're going to do the American Revolution, a topic I know you've learned about in the past, but we're going to focus on how it is an example of the Enlightenment and also how it's going to affect the world. So let's look at the major causes and effects of the American Revolution. That's our goal today. And there it is, the American Revolution. Again, you can think of this as kind of a timeline, how we've got the Enlightenment, and then those Enlightenment ideas are spreading, and then ultimately the American Revolution will be a consequence of that. Let's get some context. Let's figure out kind of the lay of the land before we get into the revolution in the first place. And as you know, Britain had 13 colonies stretching from Georgia up to Massachusetts and New Hampshire area up here, all along the eastern seaboard. And then, of course, France had colonies up near modern-day Canada, and they also owned the Louisiana Territory. So that's the background. Now, the first permanent British colony in the United States was something called Jamestown, which was established in 1607. And so by the
mid-1700s, the American colonists had been living in America for over a century and a half, actually. And that was enough time to pass that even though they were, in fact, English citizens, American colonists started to think of themselves as something different, that they're not entirely British, they're something new, something American, that whether you lived in North Carolina or Virginia or Maryland, you had something in common that set you apart from the British. Now, this mindset shift, let's think about how would that affect the relationship between Britain and the American colonies, this idea that I'm American, not necessarily just British. So let's look at our first conflict today. This is not the American Revolution, but it's a conflict that's going to play a major role in setting the stage for that conflict. It is the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So main idea number one, the French and Indian War changed the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. Again, lay of the land here. British colonies here, up here, French colonies right through here, and right here is an area that says disputed. So this is an area where claims were overlapping. That Britain felt they owned this, the French thought they owned that, and of course anytime you have two people reaching for the same object, it's going to lead to conflict. So the war is really about that area right here. That's where it's going to begin. Now, the war goes on basically from 1754 until 1763. In the course of this war, the British are going to win and the French are going to lose. And they're not going to lose just the war. They're going to lose lots and lots of territory. What had been French territory is now British territory. So the French are basically kicked out, and the British have really the leadership position, at least on the eastern half of the North American continent. Now, the British may have won, but in the process of winning this war, they also earned themselves an enormous debt. Wars are crazy expensive, guys. And so someone has to pay down that debt. Who is that someone? Well, of course, it's going to be the taxpayers. And the British expected the American colonists to foot some of the bill themselves. Another thing that the British did as a consequence of this war, that's going to lead to some tensions, is they established a line. You've heard of the Proclamation Line before, maybe the Proclamation of 1763, it's also known as. This basically said that British colonists were not allowed to settle over here. And the reason the British did this is right as the war was winding up, a massive rebellion of Native Americans broke out over here. It's called Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's Uprising. And as I just said a moment ago, wars are really expensive, and the British didn't want the danger of another rebellion, another Indian war. So they thought if they basically put this line right here and trap Americans on this side and not on that side, then it'll maintain the peace. All right, main idea number two. The American Revolution began because many colonists believed Britain had violated Americans' natural rights.
Let's talk about the road to the Revolution. And as you know, taxes play a big role in the American Revolution. So let's think about taxes generally for a second. What is the point of taxes? Why does the government even collect taxes? And the answer, of course, is the government has to have funds to do all the things that they do. It takes a lot of money to run a government. Now, the Americans were not against paying taxes. They were already paying taxes to their local authorities. What they resented and what they pushed back against was this idea that they should have to pay taxes to the British Parliament when they don't actually have any representation in the British Parliament. The Americans said that taxation without representation was a violation of their natural rights. Remember, natural rights, those are rights given to you by your Creator. They are things like, according to John Locke anyways, life, liberty, and property. These are rights that no government can take away, and you have a right to overthrow that government to protect those rights if necessary. So there's a lot of pushback against these various taxes, whether the tax was on tea or on sugar or on stamps. You maybe heard about the Stamp Act before. There's a lot of opposition growing in America against this because we felt our natural rights were being violated. Ultimately, that distrust and unhappiness grew into the point where bloodshed happened. So in 1775, in April of 1775, there was the first battle, the Battle of Lexington up in Massachusetts. And fighting will go on all the way until 1781, and with the final British defeat at the Battle of Yorktown. So a long war. Now, we are not going to go through all the different battles of the war, but you may have heard of a couple of these. I know you've learned about them. Other than the first and last major battle, the only other one I want to talk about very briefly is the Battle of Saratoga. This is considered basically the turning point of the Revolution. I'll tell you why in just a minute. So after the Battle of Saratoga, we got word that the French were willing to help us. The French under Louis XVI were willing to give America money and weapons and even bring soldiers over here to help us fight against the British. And their help was absolutely instrumental. It's hard to imagine a scenario in which we won our independence the way we did without without French help. Now, the question you might be asking yourself is, why would one absolute monarch, the King of France, help us fight against another absolute monarch, the King of England? Why would he do that? After all, we're talking about getting rid of monarchy. Why would he back such a revolutionary idea? And the answer, of course, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So the British and the French were enemies. France wants revenge from its defeat in the French and Indian War, and if America can win its independence, that would weaken the British. Therefore, it's in the French interest to help us. Now, that French help will come back to haunt King Louis XVI in a very personal way. We'll get to that in a later topic, but let's move on. Main idea number 3, the Enlightenment greatly influenced the actions and documents of the American Founding Fathers. We're going to look at a document today called the Declaration of Independence. I know you know what that is. You've heard of it. July 4th, 1776 and all that stuff. But what actually was the Declaration of Independence? That's the big question. Well, it is a great example of an enlightened document. Its author was one Thomas Jefferson, who was a young man at the time, only in his 30s, and he was tasked with drawing up this announcement, basically, that America was permanently breaking up with Britain, and we were doing so in a way that shows that we were justified in our actions. And in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson said that King George III, the English king, had broken the social contract. He was not respecting our natural rights, and therefore we had a right to break up with him. And that is a very John Locke idea. And again, you can look at this document and say, here's a good example of taking Enlightenment ideas and actually putting them into action. Now, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, which was very early in the war. It was definitely not clear we were going to win the war in the summer of 1776. And so
the signers of the Declaration knew they were taking a big risk by signing their name to it, because if they were caught, they of course would be found guilty of treason and perhaps even executed. This led Benjamin Franklin to famously say about the signers of the Declaration of Independence that we must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. All right, our next big Enlightenment document from this time period would, of course, be the U.S. Constitution. So during the Revolution, we came up with a constitution of sorts called the Articles of Confederation. And that system of government did not last all that long after the Revolution. It was found lacking in a lot of features that people wanted. So it was replaced by the Constitution we're using today. And in that Constitution, the government that was established, the one we use today, is a great example of something called federalism. And federalism is all about the idea of taking power and basically sharing it between the local authorities and the states, and also the federal or national government and the national capital. So you have these dueling but also cooperating layers of power. That way one side doesn't get too powerful at the expense of the other. The new Constitution also established a separation of powers. You have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, and this is very much in keeping with which Enlightenment thinker? Montesquieu, right? Montesquieu, three branches of government. All right, the Bill of Rights. Anybody know what the Bill of Rights even was? If you say the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, you're right. So the Constitution was amended almost immediately after being adopted with 10 specific amendments, 10 changes, in other words, and these were to explicitly list the rights you have as an American citizen. And you can see the ideas of John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire all throughout these amendments. Now, we're not going to go through every amendment because, again, this is a world history class, not an American history class. You've learned about them in the past, and you'll learn about them again when you take U.S. government. But obviously, we want to point out the First Amendment, which is first for a reason. It's the most important. It guarantees your freedom of religion, your freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, and your freedom to peacefully assemble and to petition the government. The other amendments, things like trial by jury, prohibition of excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment, these are all very, very important rights. Again, rights that sometimes we take for granted because we assume they've always been there. Trust me, they were not. This was revolutionary, the idea that you're going to have a list of rights that you have guarantees as a citizen. This was really unusual in the world around us. Now, if you wanted some specific influences of the Enlightenment, again, I mentioned a moment ago that all these thinkers are just embedded in the Constitution. You can see some examples, things, for example, like limiting government power. That's a John Locke idea. Checks and balances. That's a Montesquieu idea. The election of our president, our Congress, and our local citizens. That's a Rousseau idea. That's social contract idea. Voltaire believed heavily in things like religious freedom and free speech. Well, that's protected in the First Amendment. So let's think globally for just a second. How would the American Revolution actually affect world history? And the answer, of course, is we proved that a government can be established by the people, that a king or queen was not necessary for our survival, and with our example, other countries will follow. Obviously, the French are going to go next, and then you're going to see independence movements all across Latin America, from Mexico all the way to the south. Our revolution definitely inspired revolutions around the world. All right, in the next video, we're going to take a look at the beginning of the French Revolution, get that revolution going. Again, it's all about the Enlightenment.